Well, hey there, welcome back. So, we're doing a series at the moment where we're looking at verses that are often taken out of context. And we've looked at a few looking at particularly controversial issues, things like divorce and, women having to be subject to their husbands and these sorts of things. But what I want to look at today, it's one that I've actually haven't heard taken out of context or even talked about actually for quite a while. Now that's just in my own church, that may not be true in your church, and so this may be very relevant. But it was certainly one that was a pretty popular verse to talk about. Maybe 20 odd years ago when I became a Christian. Now, just to say, it's not that we don't talk about it at all anymore, but it was really the big issue for quite a long time there. And it's this whole idea of the mark of the beast, this 666. And what does it mean? What is it actually referring to? And there's been all sorts of different ideas and different speculation as to what this is in reference to. And that's been true really for centuries, really for the whole history of the church. There's always been sort of questions or, assumptions about what is actually going on, because Revelation it's a book full of figurative language. It's a book full of metaphors, and the idea of them is to be interpreted, to be, they're talking about something in reality, but they're using figurative language to describe these things. And so the question then becomes, well, in the case of the mark of the beast, what is that? And what makes it a bit more complicated is that whatever you think about the mark of the beast, whatever your interpretation of Revelation is, really depends on how you understand the literature. If you think that Revelation is something written for sort of all times in all places, and it sort of has significance to your particular time and place right now, then you're going to be looking around at something that is sort of relevant or something within your own particular lifetime. So an example of this would be maybe during the medieval times and certainly up into the Reformation, where the assumption of the mark of the beast is in reference to the Pope. And so this is particularly going to be the case during the Reformation, where you've got very anti-Catholic sentiment emerging and forming the Protestant church. And part of the impetus of that is going to be that the Pope himself is the Antichrist, is the beast, or the mark of the beast is that. And there would even be attempts to sort of take the title for the Pope and to see if that calculates to some sort of number that would be 666. And so that would make sense. If you're looking around and you're saying, well, if this is talking about something that is a terrible thing for Christians, and this beast is something that is an imminent threat to the church, then from at least a Reformationist point of view, that would be the Pope. That's exactly why you're having this whole Reformation in the first place. So that's one way to look at Revelation, that it's always sort of referring to something in your own time. But another way that you can interpret Revelation is that it's something, it's predicting the future. It's prophetic in the sense that it's telling you what is to come. And there's a sense in that. There's a sense of that sort of prophetic, predictive element to the book of Revelation. And so that must be what it's talking about. Now, the question, of course, is then what is it referring to? And how far into the future is Revelation actually predicting? And that's something that obviously nobody can possibly answer, even if you hold that position. There's no idea of knowing when that's going to be. But if it is something in the future, then you're looking towards something that is coming down the line that might be this mark of the beast, this thing that we take, specifically this mark that goes into our arm and into our forehead or onto our forehead, that prevents us from trading, from engaging in normal society. And so you're looking ahead, or you're looking at things that are new technologies that are emerging that might be what this thing is pointing towards. And so, decades ago, the assumption would be, well, that's referring to these new fangled things called barcodes. These lines that have all these numbers underneath that are, you need them in order to trade. And so barcodes were the thing for a long time. That was what the mark of the beast was referring to. And then at some point, later on, it was credit cards. Credit cards were the thing. Credit cards, and particularly credit cards that have the chips in them, that's obviously the mark of the beast. That's something, because of quite obviously you can't trade without a credit card in this new world that is coming, and so therefore it must be it must be credit cards. Or as technology develops more, it becomes things more like, digital IDs or QR codes. That's the mark, because it's a physical mark. It's something that we can actually, see and handle, and that must be what it's in reference to. And so anything associated with purchasing, anything associated with buying and selling, which is what the mark of the beast prevents us from doing, or not having the mark of the beast is what, according to Revelation, prevents us from doing, is to trade, is to buy goods, to engage with society. Fast forward a little bit further, and most of you would remember only a few years ago where it was a vaccine. It was the COVID vaccine, and that must be what the mark of the beast is. And you could make a good case, because at least here in Australia, there was a period where you literally couldn't go to the shops unless you had a vaccine, proof of a vaccine, unless you had something that told the shops that you have had the vaccine, therefore you can come into their shops and you can buy food. So, if anything, if there was ever going to be a correlation, you could certainly see where that would come from. And so that was the big thing, the most recent one of what this mark of the beast might be. But whatever the prediction is, it's always a new thing. It's always something towards the new technology. But what it stems from is a reading of Revelation which says that it's something in the future. It's predicting future things that haven't yet come to be. And things like one world governments or one universal currency or crypto or whatever the new thing is, whatever the thing that seems to be something that has a controlling element to it. That's clearly what the mark of the beast is, and that's what John must have been referring to all those years ago when he wrote this stuff down. The problem, at least for me, at least for somebody who sort of reads the New Testament a little bit more historically, is that it assumes that when John was writing Revelation, when he was getting all of these insights and prophecies from Jesus, it suggests that somehow or other John was writing down something that was only going to relate to at least 2,000 years from his time. That Jesus would go to all the trouble to give him all of these prophecies and all of this revelation for something that wasn't going to happen for 2 millennia. And, at the time, the Christians were being persecuted. And at the time, they really needed something that was going to be encouraging for them and something that was going to, at least give them some sort of insight into what was going on behind the scenes of the persecution they were facing. But in the midst of that, Jesus would come along and say, look, I'm going to give you all this insight, but it's not for you. It's for people for 2,000 years from now in a world that you would just have no concept. There's no possible way you can understand that world. That's what I'm talking about. So all I need you to do is write this down and hold on to it so that those people 2,000 years from now can get the benefit from what you're writing. At least for me, that's a bit of a problematic way to read the New Testament, and certainly the book of Revelation. That's at least my take on it. And so what I want to do today, what I want to look at today is what this is talk about the mark of the beast, but try to find a solution to it, an answer to this question of what it is, something that's a little bit more relevant to its own time, something a bit more, at least centered in the first century when this letter was first written, and something that might have been at least how they would have perceived it to be, something that would have been more relevant to what it is that they're experiencing at the time. Now, fortunately to do that, we don't have to look very far outside of the New Testament to get a sense of what this thing might be referring to. In fact, what we're going to talk about is really the solution to the book of Revelation, what is going on behind the scenes, or what is really going on at the very writing of Revelation, this overarching situation that not just John, but the entire Christian world was facing at the time. This is really the solution to it. This is what is going on that is really underscoring what we're looking at when we look at this mark of the beast, and that is simply the imperial cult, or put more simply, this is the worship of the emperor. So the emperor of Rome, certainly by the time of John, and for many years before that, had become a god. He was seen to be a god, and so you were expected as a citizen of the Roman Empire to worship him as a god. And quite simply, the Christians refused to do it. It's just as simple as that. And what they faced as a result of that was persecution. Now, to be sure, the Jews also refused to worship this imperial cult, but they kind of got an exemption from it. They didn't worship any pagan gods, anything that was outside of Yahweh. They didn't worship any of that. They understood it all to be just paganism, and so had nothing to do with it. And so the Romans had always sort of given them a pass on all of that, because they've been doing that for centuries. They've never worshipped any of our gods or the Greek gods before that, or they've never been involved in any of that. And so it's never been a problem. We're just not going to worry about it. It's a different story when the Christians come along, because many of the Christians by now are Gentiles, and these Gentiles had previously worshipped all of the other gods. They'd worshipped the pagan gods. They'd worshipped, even up to that point, had probably worshipped the emperor as well, but then had become Christians and now were refusing to do so. And so the problem that that's causing for the Christians, at least for these Gentile Christians, is that as far as anybody else is concerned, is that they're turning their backs on the gods, and they're turning their backs on Rome. They're turning their backs on the emperor. And as a result of that, they are, well, basically treasonous. They're basically, by turning your back against the gods, is to invite the wrath of the gods, is to invite the enmity of the gods, that they would come and punish you, but also not just you, everybody around you, the whole city that you're associated with will be punished as a result of your offending the gods by refusing to worship them. And so the Christians faced this challenge really from day one. This was always the challenge that they faced, for being who they are, for trying to be Christian within this sort of Greco-Roman world. And so where this really comes into prominence, and what really underscores the book of Revelation, is specifically the imperial cult, really sort of the most obvious and the most explicit form of this type of pagan worship. So that's kind of a bit of a spoiler where we're going to, but let's just at least try to understand where this idea comes from. What is the imperial cult? How does it come about? And really, why does it culminate so severely, seemingly, in the book of Revelation? So the story of this actually goes back to a comet back in July 44 BC. This was a comet that was, we don't know which one it was, but it was one that was flying around the Earth for about a week or so. And it just happened to coincide with the funeral games of Julius Caesar. A few months prior to that, Julius Caesar had been assassinated. And so in honor of him, his adopted son, Octavian, put on a celebration, put on games in honor of his now adopted father, and as a way of celebrating his life. Now, at the very same time, as I said, this comet was flying around. And so Octavian sort of took the initiative. He took sort of the political initiative and said, well, you know what that is, don't you? You know what that comet is? That's Julius Caesar. That's Dad becoming a god. He has just become divine. Now, Julius Caesar had already been kind of alluding to this in his own lifetime. He'd already started to get pretty grand ideas about himself and about his achievements. He had done some pretty extraordinary things, and it had sort of started to get to his head a little bit, to this idea that maybe, in fact, he is more than human. Maybe he is something closer to a god. Now, for most people in the ancient world, the idea of a man being a god wasn't controversial at all. They'd been doing that for millennia. Think about the pharaohs who were also gods. Think about the Greek kings who were also at the same time divine. This is not a new idea. But one group in particular that resented the idea that any man could become a god was the Romans. The Romans were much more, what we might say, down to earth. They just couldn't stomach the idea that a man could be a god at the same time. Men were men, gods were gods. You don't try to mix the two together. And so for them, that had always been their driving ethos. You cannot have a man who is also divine. And so the idea of Julius Caesar thinking that he is somewhat divine wasn't just problematic because it was a bit of an ego trip, but it was really going against the whole Roman idea of what it means to be a man. And so this was becoming problematic. In fact, it's what led to his assassination. He had established a dictatorship. He had basically declared himself dictator for life over Rome, which is another thing that was anathema to the Romans, who would never have, the whole Roman ethos, apart from men can't be gods, is that we will never have a king again. We're never going to have a king. We're always going to be ruled by a senate, by consuls. And so the idea of Caesar, not just taking the dictatorship for life for himself, but also starting to suggest ideas that perhaps he is in fact a god too. This is all deeply troubling for the more traditional conservative Roman elites who just saw this as a direct challenge to themselves and really just a threat to Rome in and of itself. And so as a result of that, they assassinated him. Well, anyway, we fast forward a couple of months and now the adopted son of Caesar, Octavian, now puts on these games and there's this comet flying around which he now declares to be God. This is Caesar becoming God, which becomes very beneficial for him because that at the same time gives him divine status. Now, it's not that Octavian said, well, look at me, I'm a god as well, but he could start to take claim to the title of son of God or son of a god. There's lots of gods. Caesar has now become one of them, and I am his son. And so that gives him some sort of divine status. Not that he's a god, but there's something special about this kid. And, as the years roll on, he eventually becomes the emperor. That's a whole different story. But he eventually becomes the sole ruler of Rome. And, well, along with this title of the Son of God. Now, by this point, everybody was just ready just to let him take control. Octavian became the sole ruler of Rome. Again, a whole different story. But what the Roman Senate had really sort of come to realize is that there's no point resisting this anymore. There'd been civil wars, there'd been people rising up trying to take control of Rome, and eventually they had just had jack of it all, and they said, look, if you can just be a sensible ruler, then we'll just get behind you. And there really wasn't a lot of choice by that point because Octavian had control of the armies. They had come fully under his control, so nobody could resist him anyway. It's like you can resist, but you're going to die. So they're like, all right, fine, we'll get behind you. And so as a way of just kind of appeasing him, as a way of kind of just sort of showing him some level of support, they gave him a new title. This new title was, in the Latin, Augustus, which literally just means revered. Somebody who has something of a divine characteristic about them. Not that they're a god, but there's something that is worthy of the highest respect, if not divine worship to some degree. And so Augustus becomes a title, but really it's what we come to know him as. And so we talk about the Emperor Augustus. That was really his title, but really it kind of became the name that he took for himself. Now, at the same time, they started to offer libations to him. When you're having a meal, a banquet with your friends, you'll offer a drink offering. And now, typically that would be to a god. Well, what you would also do is offer a drink offering to the emperor. And so, in a sense, you're kind of associating him with somebody to whom you're giving thanks in the same way that you would to the gods. You're honoring the emperor as well. And over time, what begins to happen is that Augustus, he takes control of Rome, but at the same time, he becomes Rome. He is solely responsible for the well-being of Rome. If Rome is successful, it's because of him. If Rome is doing well, that's because of his great leadership and really because of the divine status that he has, the divine approval that he has from the gods, that they are behind him. And that's why we're having success. And so give that enough time, and what that ends up looking like is that if you question the emperor, you're questioning Rome. Or if you challenge or try to undermine the emperor himself, you're actually undermining Rome, because to attack him is to attack Rome itself. And so they become one and the same thing. And so as a result of that, the idea of worshiping him is your way of upholding the best for Rome. By honoring him, you're honoring Rome. You're showing your allegiance to Rome. You're showing that, Rome is your main priority, and you're doing that through the worship of him, or through the worship of the emperor. And so the two ideas kind of all become one and the same thing. The emperor becomes Rome, Rome is the emperor, you worship Rome, you're worshiping the emperor, and vice versa. And what that then becomes is a way for the Roman citizens, or the population of Rome, to show him honor, to uphold him as this super person, this great person that he is, this great leader that he is. And it's a way of really sort of getting his attention. It becomes a way of just sort of getting his imperial favor. This is a world where it's a quid pro quo setup. And that's, I mean, I guess it's true in all societies, but it's especially true of the first century. It's very much quid pro quo. If I do something for you, I'll get something in return. And so what the cities and residents of cities would come to realize is that if we honor him and set up a cult, or we set up the worship of him, he will give us some sort of imperial favor. If we're showing him our loyalty by worshiping him, then surely he's going to give us something good in return. And so what starts to pop up all throughout the Roman Empire are temples in honor of the emperor. There are temples and there's cults and there's celebrations, and these become the primary forms of worship. There's lots of gods in every city, but the primary one now becomes the imperial cult because this one has immediate benefits. The problem with worshiping Greek and Roman gods is that we don't know what they want. We don't know who they are. We don't know where they are. We don't know what they're doing. And if we worship them wrong, then they're going to punish us, but we don't know what we've done wrong. And it's all just very arbitrary. At least with the imperial cult, you worship the emperor and you can get his immediate favor in return because he can see what you're doing and he is the god that we're worshiping. Now, at no point would Augustus say, yes, I am indeed a god right now. The idea was that when he dies, like Caesar wasn't a god until he died. Once he died, he became a god, and that becomes the new idea. You have the divine status. You are the son of a god, but you're not a god in and of itself. Whatever that distinction is, it's all a bit strange, but when you die, absolutely you become a god. You go and you live amongst the divine beings. So that is what's going to happen. But that doesn't mean that you can't worship him now. And no one's going to stop you from doing that. Certainly not the emperor, because it's quite flattering. I mean, if somebody's treating you like a god and you kind of got a pretty big view of yourself, you're not going to say no. There's no sense of humility, certainly amongst the Roman elites, that they would say, oh, no, that's too much. No, I'm just a humble man. No. Bring it on. That's fine. I'm not going to stop you. I'm not going to necessarily correct you, but at the same time, I'm not going to stop you either. So this takes off. This whole idea of this imperial cult really just spreads like wildfire through the empire, and especially in the eastern part of the empire. So when I talk about the eastern part of the empire, I'm talking about Greece, modern-day Turkey, where what used to be Alexander's empire, prior to that, what used to be the Persian Empire, all of those empires really had no problem with worshipping a man as a god. Think about the Egyptians again with the pharaohs. This idea had been just part and parcel of living in that part of the world for centuries and centuries. And so all of the imperial cult was just the latest iteration of this idea that we've had now for centuries. And so they had no problem adopting this idea. Romans, again, were different. Romans had their own idea about men being gods. The Greeks and the Persians and sort of what used to be Alexander's empire, a whole different story. And so they happily embraced this because, again, for them, what it meant was that it could show the emperor, show the imperial family their loyalty, and in return receive back imperial favor. So right from the word go, this thing is going like wildfire all through Asia Minor, all through that eastern part of the empire, exactly the place where Revelation is taking place. All of the churches of Revelation all are situated in what was called Asia Minor, which is now Western Turkey, but places like Ephesus, Laodicea, Hierapolis, Colossae, Sardis, Pergamum, all of these are right smack bang in Asia Minor, very right in the heart of where this idea of worshipping men was never a problem. And so the imperial cult just goes crazy there. It becomes the big thing now that everybody is adopting to, and the cities are really trying to outdo themselves. These cities that John is writing these letters to, they're all trying to outdo themselves in how celebrated and how big they can make their imperial cults because they want the imperial favor. They want the emperors to show them particular favor. So then the imperial cult is the new thing, and what that then sort of leads to is a succession. When Augustus became the emperor, there wasn't really a clear plan for how to formalize it. It was quite an informal arrangement. Again, it's a whole different story, but there was no real succession plan then for who was going to come next. The assumption would be that it would go to his children, but his children had actually died and his daughters he'd exiled. It had all been a bit of a family chaotic mess. It would have been the story of a reality TV show, really. But eventually, Augustus adopted a much older man, not older than him, but a man in about his 40s, a guy by the name of Tiberius. And so he adopted him and therefore became his son. And so he was then going to be the new heir to the throne, the new heir to the empire. Now, Tiberius is the emperor that we know of because it was under Tiberius that Jesus was crucified. So Jesus was born during the time of Augustus, but he died under the reign of Tiberius. Now, just the timing of that in and of itself is important for us to recognize, because the imperial cult really hit the scene at exactly the same time as Christianity. When Jesus came, he came during the reign of Augustus at exactly the same time as this imperial cult was starting to take shape. And so Christianity grew up at the same time and at the same sort of within the same world as what this imperial cult was. And so in the same way that the imperial cult was taking off, Christianity was as well. And it was only going to be a matter of time before the two came into conflict. But Tiberius, he's not God. That's the idea. You're not a god while you're alive. You only become a god upon death. And so he took that very seriously. He was, quite traditional in that sense. But that didn't stop people from worshiping him. That didn't stop people from giving him the honors as a god in the same way they had done for Augustus. And so what happens is that these sort of divine imagery gets sort of circulated around him, divine ideas get circulated around him. It's the same as with Augustus. He doesn't believe it. He's not endorsing it, but at the same time, he's not trying to stop it. And there's actually one famous account from our Gospels where we see this interplay between the Jewish people and the imperial cult. It's where Jesus is in the temple and they come up to him and they say, tell us, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And so Jesus says, show me a coin. And so they pull out a denarius, and on the denarius, he says, whose face is on that? And they say, well, that's Caesar's. Now, the Caesar they're talking about is the Emperor Tiberius. And on the other side of that coin, and you can see images of it, just Google the Tiberius denarius and you'll see the coin. On the other side of that is an image of his mother. So his mother, Livia, but she's in the form of a goddess. She's in the form of Pax or peace, because everything was a god in the ancient world, including peace. And in fact, one of the things that sort of characterizes this new imperial regime that's begun by Augustus is this thing called the Pax Romana. It's the idea that this empire now has found peace because of what Augustus has done. Augustus has come, he's restored the empire, he's restored order, he's brought about peace. There's no civil wars anymore, there's no fighting. There's peace within the boundaries of the empire. And that's all because of Augustus. In fact, Augustus's birthday comes to be celebrated as effectively a public holiday, as a day of celebration, as the day that the good news came to the world. The good news being that Augustus has come and that he's restored order to the world, to the Roman Empire, which is basically the world. And so that becomes a point of celebration. And all of that is associated with his image, with the idea of him being a god. And so what the Romans will say is, you have peace because of us, because of this imperial cult, because the emperors are divine. They are the ones, through their divine abilities, are providing peace and providing the prosperity that you guys are taking advantage of. And so again, if you question the imperial cult, if you challenge the empire, and specifically the emperor himself, then you are undermining the peace. You're undermining the prosperity and the concord that we've got as an empire. You are an immediate political threat. That's nothing less than treason, what it is that you're doing there. And so this becomes a genuine problem. Now, again, for everybody in the world, it's fine. Like worshipping the emperor as God, we worship thousands of gods. What's another god? At least this one gives us immediate benefits. And so there's no problem for them to do that. But for the Jews, for the Christians, it's becoming an increasing problem because, well, we don't worship other gods. It's just as simple as that. And we're certainly not going to be worshiping the emperor and saying that that's God when he's clearly not. And so Tiberius, he's a fairly moderate sort of leader. He doesn't fully embrace the imperial cult in his own life, but again, as is the plan, when he dies, he will obviously become a god as well. Things start to change with the next emperor, though. The next emperor to come along is a young guy by the name of Caligula. Now, Caligula only rules for 4 years, and by all accounts, he was a psychopath. He was just an absolute sociopath. He was just if even half the stories about this guy are true, this is just pure evil manifest as a human. So just an absolutely terrible, terrible leader, to the point where he was ultimately assassinated because he was just such a bad leader that his own people were like, nah, we're done with you and we're going to get rid of you. And part of the problem was that he wasn't going to wait for he wasn't going to wait for death to become a god. He wanted to be a god here in this life right now. And so he went really hard at it. He was very forceful about making sure that he was worshipped as a god in this lifetime. So much so that he started to get statues of the legitimate gods like Jupiter and Zeus, the Greek equivalent of the same god, and had some of the best statues of these gods brought from Greece over to Rome and took the heads off them and put his own head on them. So I am the manifestation of these gods. I am Jupiter. I am Zeus in the flesh. And so that is now being portrayed in the form of these statues. In some cases, he would actually stand himself amongst, so imagine a row of statues of gods. He would stand himself amongst that row, pretending to be a statue of a god. I don't know if you've seen these people you see around cities that they paint themselves in gold or silver and they just stand perfectly still like a statue and they just hold it until you give them some money and then they'll move a little bit. And the really good ones are quite scary, actually, how much they can actually make themselves look like a statue. So you got to kind of imagine Caligula doing that, and then people coming along to just admiring the gods, and then he sort of jumps out at them like, hey, I'm a god as well, and just scare the hell out of them. Just a bit of a jerk in that way. So, but again, just this idea that I am a god and I'm taking my rightful place amongst the other gods. I am a god like these ones. Something he also did was to set up a temple for himself. So he's a god, so therefore he needs a temple. And in that temple was a life-size statue of himself made of gold, and every day it will be dressed in the same clothing that he was wearing that day. And so again, this idea that I'm a god, so therefore I deserve a temple and a statue and all the rest of it. So really starting to see himself in this way. Where he really went too far was that just before he was assassinated. Now, he was assassinated before he managed to pull this off, but he was on his way to do it. One of the things that he was attempting to do was to go to Jerusalem and set up a statue of himself in the Temple of Jerusalem. Now, you can only imagine how horrific and the fallout from that would have been absolutely catastrophic. It would have just been all sorts of devastation. Fortunately, sadly to say, he was assassinated before he could pull that off. But that's kind of an indication of just how far this guy was willing to take this idea that he had already become a god. And again, there's just no way of describing how devastating that would have been had he got away with that. So anyway, he's assassinated and the scourge of him has sort of been washed away. And so the new emperor that comes along is a guy by the name of Claudius. The whole story behind his ascent to power is a story in and of itself, but he becomes the new emperor, and he is much more, he's a lot older, and he's much more sensible in that way. By all accounts, he's a pretty good emperor. In fact, this is the emperor that really the church grew up under. So Paul's missionary journeys generally took place under the rule of Claudius. And by all accounts, his reign was marked by just good order. Caligula had almost bankrupted Rome, and so trying to reestablish the Roman economy, but just generally trying to restore some sense of credibility to Rome and certainly to the imperial family. And so he was absolutely against the idea of him being a god. He was much more traditional, conservative in that way. And, again, when I die, I'll become a god, sure, but that's not right now. And so until then, I'm just a normal emperor. If you want to worship me, if you want to worship the imperial cult, if you want to honor the family through your worship, that's fine. I'm not going to stop you, but I'm not going to say, yeah, I deserve it because I'm a god. So he brought about a sense of normality and ruled very peacefully for quite some time. But eventually he was assassinated, as these things tend to happen, and almost certainly by his wife, Agrippina, who was the mother of the next emperor, who was Nero. And so the story, it would make sense that she wants to assassinate or have Claudius knocked off so that her son Nero can become the next emperor of Rome. And so Nero ascends to the throne at the age of 17. Now, again, like Claudius, he starts off pretty well. He's a pretty, and look, he's only 17. He's very much a mummy's boy. He doesn't really have sort of his own sort of ambitions for himself. He's kind of put there by his mum, and she's kind of pulling the strings over his rule. And so for the first few years, that's sort of how it is. And they're sort of co-ruling as, mother and son. They're sort of ruling the empire, and all seems to be going pretty well. But after a few years, about 8 years, he actually kills his mum, as just the way that these things tend to happen. So he kills his mother, and from that point forward, he kind of loses it. He really sort of steps into insanity. And by all accounts, his life sort of goes on a very dark spiral for the rest of his days. And again, I mean, I guess that would make sense. I've never killed my mother, but if I had, I'm pretty sure I'm going to be in a pretty bad mental place first to do it, but then as a result of doing that as well. So that's not going to bode well for his mental state at the very least. And that seems to be reflected in the way that he rules now from in the years going forward, because he, like Caligula, was absolutely of the opinion that he is a god in this life and he wanted to be worshipped as such. And so he does very, very similar things. In fact, he goes a much bigger step further than what Caligula did, and had the idea of building for himself a enormous palace, just an extremely large place for a complex just for himself, and also had set up a 120-foot high statue of himself as a god. Now, at least that was the plan. That's what he intended to do. But in order to do that, he needed some space in Rome. Rome is very compact. There's a lot of people living there. There's no space for any new development to go on. And so in order for that to happen, in order for it to have enough space to build this grand palace of his, he needed to clear out some of the debris, some of the more scummy areas of Rome. And so what happens is that a fire is set off. A fire begins in Rome, and this thing burns for days and weeks. This is an enormous fire that takes out a lot of Rome. And no one is really certain exactly who started it, but all fingers are pointed at Nero. He is the sort of person that would quite happily do this. And by certain accounts, he was playing a fiddle. He was playing, just playing an instrument and just singing to himself while he was watching Rome burn. So whatever you want to believe about the accounts, there's certainly they attach the blame to Nero. Now, Nero kind of realizes, hey, this isn't really good, what I've done here, this burning Rome down. People are going to start asking questions. They might start pointing fingers. This could end very badly for me. And so he decides that he needs to point the finger at somebody else. He needs to divert the blame away from him. And so he blames the Christians. Now, this is actually interesting because it gives us sort of a sense of how much or how quickly Christianity had been growing, to the point where the emperor himself actually even knew it existed. Now, there's lots of different cults and lots of religions and lots of various gods and all sorts of things happening in the Roman Empire. The fact that Christians could even be known at that point really is sort of a testament to how much they'd grown as a result of just during this period. But also their reputation. They'd already developed for themselves a reputation. One of those reputations being, or core to that reputation, is their refusal to worship the emperor, to their refusal to engage in the imperial cult. And this was starting to cause problems for them. And so when Nero pointed the finger at them, one, he knew he could get away with it because they're a fairly passive group and they're not really going to put up a resistance. But he knew he wouldn't get much pushback because most of the people are pretty suspicious about the Christians as it was. These guys aren't worshipping the emperor. They're not engaged in the imperial cult. They've never really worshipped any of the gods as well. They're kind of problematic as it is. And so if the emperor is pointing the finger at them and saying, these are the ones who set the fire, well, that's probably just proof of what we already suspected about them, which is that they were insurrectionists, that they want to bring down Rome. And this is just proof that they literally want to bring down Rome by burning the whole city down. And so that would certainly help his cause when it came time to point the fingers at them. And so what this begins then is a mass persecution of Christians. So almost an empire-wide persecution. Now, what's really, again, there's so many interesting elements that are taking place here. One of them being that through the history of the Roman Empire, they didn't they never at any point singled out a particular group for universal persecution. They would persecute different groups at different times in different regions, but not the whole group as itself. They didn't pick out, one particular worship of one god and wherever you find it, squash it. It would just be a local variation of whatever that thing might be, but not the thing in and of itself. But Christianity was the only group that Rome persecuted en masse as a group. If you see a Christian, persecute them. We are against Christians. Wherever you find them, in whatever form they take, we don't like Christians. Therefore, we will persecute them. And this is the first real example of that under Nero, where Nero's pointing the finger and everybody's sort of going along with that. And so it's at this point that we have some of the first big martyrdoms that take place. So James, who's the head of the church, James is sort of the brother of Jesus, the one back in Jerusalem taking care of things back there. He's executed in 62. A couple of years later, Peter is executed in Rome in 64, and Paul himself is also executed at this time. Now, there's a question as to which year exactly Paul was martyred, whether it be 64 or 67. All we know is that he was martyred under Nero. Now, that could have been at 64 during this outbreak of persecution, or it could have been later on in 67. Again, we're not 100% sure when that took place, but it was all within, and it had to have been before 67 because early 68 is when Nero committed suicide. So if it was under him, it had to have been before that. So either 64, 67, we're not 100% sure, but certainly during this time of heightened persecution against the Christians. But at least for the Christians, that comes to characterize Nero. Nero is the guy who persecuted us. He's the one who said about the first outbreak, blamed us. We were innocent of this whole thing, but blamed us nevertheless and said about persecuting us. It was under him that our first three great leaders, Peter, James, and Paul, were all martyred. And so he's naturally going to be a very hated figure amongst the Christians. There's just no question about that. But after he commits suicide, if things settle down again, the Christians sort of settle back into their routines, but that's not going to last forever. In fact, only about 20 years later, we get another mass outbreak of persecution under a new emperor by the name of Domitian. And so we've actually got a couple of accounts of this, of just sort of the extent of the persecution. One of them from Eusebius, the Christian church historian. He says that Domitian, having shown great cruelty towards many, and having unjustly put to death no small number of well-born and notable men at Rome, and having without cause exiled and confiscated the property of great many other illustrious men, finally became a successor of Nero in his hatred and enmity towards God. He was in fact the second that stirred up a persecution against us, although his father Vespasian had undertaken nothing prejudicial to us. And so as far as Domitian is concerned, he's noted by the Christians as being Nero's successor in the way that he persecuted the Christians. In fact, he was seen to be worse. He persecuted a lot of people, but then when he turned his side against God, that's when it really broke out. And what he did was so much more worse than what Nero had ever done. But at the same time, the idea being that Domitian was something, sort of styled himself a little bit after Nero. He sort of looked back at Nero as being a good guy, and so wanted to sort of outdo him in whatever it is that Nero did, which included persecution. And so what we get then are these two significant periods in the early church, both within the first century. Domitian ruled from 81 to 96 AD. And so he's sort of towards the end of the first century. But both of these periods are characterized by these tyrannical emperors whose sole ambition is to persecute the Christians and to really sort of eradicate them if at all possible. Now, why all of that is important for us to understand is because it's during either the period of Nero or of Domitian when Revelation was written. It's been sort of identified as being within one of those two periods during this significant persecution during the time of these emperors. And so at some point within one of those two, Revelation is occurring and Christians are being actively persecuted at that time. Now, if it's under Nero, then as we'll see, it's a direct reference, but if it's Domitian, it still has sort of echoes back to Nero as well. So Domitian, again, styling himself after Nero. But whatever the case is, Revelation is written at a time of one of these emperors, and it's written to cities and to churches who have fully embraced the imperial cult. In fact, everywhere you go in the Roman Empire, certainly in the East, you're going to see the imperial cult. It's absolutely everywhere. And so all of the cities that Paul is preaching in and doing his ministry work in, all of them have also adopted the imperial cult themselves. So it's everywhere and it's spreading like wildfire. Everyone is embracing it wholeheartedly, but especially in those churches that are addressed in the letter of Revelation. So then if we're going to understand Revelation, at least to start with, we have to put it in its context, which is that it's written to Christians who are facing immediate persecution by a Roman government that is bent on destroying them for the singular reason that they refuse to worship the emperor. That's what it boils down to. And all the persecution that we see happening against the church, happening against Christians through the first 300 years of its history, all relate to this one issue, which is that they refuse to worship the emperor. And so this is the baseline understanding. This is the baseline context for when we're reading Revelation. So at the very least, if we're going to understand what the mark of the beast is, we need to at least look at its own time, look at it in its own context, and ask the question, could there be an explanation from its own immediate perspective, rather than having to look 2,000 years ahead? Could it be something that they were facing in the immediate time? And the answer is yes, they absolutely were. They were facing immediate persecution from emperors hell-bent on destroying them. So how then might that explain what the mark of the beast is? What is going on there that could be informing this metaphorical idea of some beast whose number is 666? Well, as with all of this, let's just have a quick look at the passage leading up to it and let's just see what it has to say. So Revelation 13:11 begins with, he says, "Then I saw a second beast coming out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. It exercised all the authority of the first beast on its behalf and made the earth and its inhabitants worship the beast, whose fatal wound had been healed." So the first beast is obviously the leader. He's the primary beast, but there's a second beast that's coming along somewhat on his behalf. He's the one who's going ahead of the main beast, and he's the one who's insisting that everybody has to worship the first beast. And he's the one who's basically commanding and effectively threatening with death anybody that doesn't. And he's able to do this because he has the authority of the first beast. He's been given permission and authority by the first beast to go out and to do this particular task. Now, anybody in John's audience would know straight away who he's talking about here. Who he's talking about here is the governor. The governors are the people who are appointed by the emperor to go into the regions and to spread imperial Rome, to make sure that imperial Rome remains imperial. That's their job. And so they have the authority of the emperor to go into a region and to demand loyalty to Rome. It's as simple as that. And that's exactly what this second beast is doing. He's going on behalf of the first beast to go and, at whatever cost, is to make sure that the first beast gets worshipped via the imperial cult. Verse 13, it says, "And it performed great signs, even causing fire to come down from heaven to the earth in full view of the people. Because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast, who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refused to worship the idol, the image, to be killed." So it's kind of obvious language here. He's setting up an image of the first beast. Well, what is that? Well, that's every single statue of the emperor, because every single statue of the emperor portrays him as a god. And there's temples that are set up with images of the emperor that you can worship. That's literally what it is. And what happens if you don't worship the emperor? What happens if you don't worship the image? You're going to get killed. It's as simple as that. And so for everyone in the Roman Empire, it's fine. We're going to worship the emperor, worship the image. It's not a problem for us. We're worshiping 1,000 gods anyway. What's another one? Different story for the Christians. They cannot do that. They cannot stomach worship. It's not something they can ever possibly do. And so as a result of that, they're going to be punished up until the point of death, which is exactly what we see happening to the Christians throughout this period. They get killed because they don't worship the emperor. And so then what it says in verse 16, it says it forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark, which is the name of the beast or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the person who has insight calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man. That number is 666. And so everyone has to receive the mark. The mark being 666. Now, you might just say, why is he talking in such figurative language? Well, this is anti-imperial rhetoric. This is very treasonous language that's been said here. And so you're going to couch it in some sort of metaphorical language, which isn't as obvious to an outsider, certainly somebody who might dob you into the Roman authorities for being insurrectionists. So you're going to talk in a way that is sort of figurative language that an educated audience would understand. People that hear this, they will understand what's going on. They've got that sort of framework to understand it. But for everybody else on the outside looking in and going, that's just weird stuff that you're talking about. That makes no sense to us, whatever. But for the Christians, they understand what this is. And what it's referring to is very simple. Get this mark on your hand or on your forehead. What is that representing? Well, that's representing your thoughts and your actions. The way you think has to be in line with what the second beast is commanding, and the way that you act also has to be in line with what the second beast is commanding. Think and act the way that we tell you to, or else you're going to get punished. You're going to get killed. At the very least, you're not going to be allowed to buy and sell. In other words, you can't come to the shops. You can't engage in good society. You can't be part of the society and therefore survive, be able to buy food, be able to go into shop and to look after your families and do all the things you would normally do. You can't do that because you've refused to take the mark. Now, of course, you can see how that would translate in a modern context to an understanding of a microchip or a vaccine. That there's definitely a correlation there. But what it's referring to is this sort of tyrannical idea that you get in genuine tyrannies and genuine fascist states that says, unless you think and act the way that we tell you to, you cannot buy food. You cannot engage with society. It's as simple as that. So think like us, think how we tell you to think, act the way we tell you to act, and everything will go well for you. But if you want to go and be a free thinker, if you want to go and be somebody who's some maverick who's out there doing their own thing and refusing to honor us and to toe the line with, good society, you can't be part of good society. It's as simple as that. So take the mark, take this mark, this 666, and that's going to be literally your ticket to society. That's going to be your way into engaging with good society. Which leaves us then with the question of, what is the 666? Well, it's actually quite simple. In the Hebrew language, every letter was assigned a numerical value. Every letter has a number attached to it, ranging from sort of 1 up to several hundred. And what it simply means is that when you write out in Hebrew the name Caesar Nero and you add the numbers up, what you come up with is 666. It's just the numerical value in the Hebrew language of Nero. That's what it is. And so take the mark. Take the mark, which is 666, which is the number of a man. What is the mark? It's the imperial cult. It's the worship of Nero, or in the case of Domitian, somebody who's styling himself along the lines of the Emperor Nero. It's taking the mark of Nero, taking the name of Nero, which is to say, worship him as a god. Think of him as a god, act like he's a god, and all will go well for you. If you can't do that, at the very least, you're going to be cut off from good society, or at worst, you're going to be killed. And so that's it. It's not that complicated. Now, that isn't to say that it doesn't have application to a future situation, but not so specific. What it simply is referring to is what you find in any totalitarian state. Anyone that is ruled by a dictator that says, I am the one single person in charge and I make all the rules, and you will do and say everything as I tell you to, or else whatever the consequences might be. That's just standard behavior in every dictatorship, in every form of government, which is just totalitarian. That's just how they rule. And that's how the Romans ruled, and how everybody after them who's done the same thing, that's just how they work. Do as we say, think as we tell you to think, or else. And so for the Christians at the time that this was written, that just happened to be either Nero or Domitian, but they were effectively the same thing. What it boiled down to was the imperial cult. So anyway, that's certainly the best historical explanation that we can have for this, and really the most straightforward one, because otherwise all we're left with is to try to guess whatever the next thing that's going to come along, that's going to be the mark of the beast. We're never going to figure it out, or it could just simply be something at that time that the Christians were facing, which in this case, again, was the imperial cult. It seems like a pretty straightforward solution to the problem. But anyway, hopefully that's been helpful, and we'll probably look at another one or two of these in the coming weeks, these sort of verses out of context. But otherwise, have a great week, and I look forward to seeing you next week. All the best.